legend of Rani Padmini is one of the most famous epics in South Asia. The story follows a beautiful Sri Lankan princess brought to India, an invading sultan consumed by lust for her, a talking parrot, a deceptive mirror trick, and a devastating medieval siege. Facing certain defeat against the sultan's army, the queen and her female companions choose mass self-immolation, a tragic climax known as Jauhar, protecting their honor from the invading forces. Today, that narrative carries immense cultural weight. It is defended so fiercely that a 2018 film adaptation exploded into nationwide protests, with political leaders demanding bans to protect the Queen's legacy. However, the primary records from the 14th century contain zero contemporary evidence that Queen Padmini actually existed. Court historians traveling directly with Sultan Khilji documented his 1303 siege of Chittorgarh Fort. They recorded a brutal, politically motivated military conquest to expand his empire. They never once mentioned a local queen, a mirror, or a romantic quest. This raises the question of how a character missing from the original historical record evolved into one of India's most fiercely defended icons. The first uncontested mention of Padmini doesn't appear until 1540, more than 2 centuries after the siege. She shows up in an Awadhi poem called Padmavat, written by a Sufi composer. This diagram illustrates the poem's true intent as a spiritual allegory, not literal history. It maps Chittor to the human body and the king to the spirit. Sultan Khilji acts as worldly illusion, laying siege to the queen, who represents human consciousness. By the late 1500s, local Rajput bards adopted the story into their oral traditions. As they did, the narrative shifted from mysticism to martial pride. The spiritual metaphors vanished. The talking parrot became a simple plot device to advance the romance, and the narrative was rewritten to highlight Rajput bravery and the defense of honor. In less than 50 years, a coded Sufi map of the human soul had been adapted into a regional war ballad. The story shifted again in the early 19th century, when British colonial writer James Todd began collecting these oral and poetic traditions. In 1829, Todd published these regional ballads as literal, factual history. His compilation introduced new dramatic inventions to the written record, most notably the story of the Sultan viewing the Queen through a mirror across a water tank. The historical landscape shifted a final time during the 20th century Swadeshi independence movement, as anti-colonial sentiments swept through India. Bengali writers and Hindu activists seized upon Todd's colonial record. They adapted the character, styling Padmini as a hero of Hindu chastity and a symbol of national identity. In this era, the mass self-immolation of the women took on urgent political meaning. It was framed as a heroic resistance against foreign invaders, reflecting the political anxieties of the modern age. Colonial misunderstanding and modern political necessity combined to lock a poetic metaphor into what is now accepted as the definitive history of the nation. This graph tracks the narrative's journey. It begins with a historical void in 1303, spikes into a Sufi metaphor in 1540, shifts to a heroic ballad in 1589, solidifies as colonial history in 1829, and peaks as a nationalistic icon today. The documented military conquest of 1303 left a historical void, which was eventually superseded by the legacy of the myth. The legend survived because it offered a blank canvas. Each successive generation could project their own values, fears, and political needs onto the story. Queen Padmini may not appear in the 14th century archives, but her evolution proves that the stories a culture invents can shape its reality more powerfully than documented facts.